I am going to mostly be a moderator, but I will occasionally weigh in when there's something useful I can say. But I think to start, the best place to go is maybe turn to Valerie, and she can tell us about EPI's historical work in the education space in terms of what's it's focused on, why is this work is important, and why does it stand out, and how does it relate to today's policy debates. So, Valerie?
All right, thanks, Josh, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone joining us. I think if there were one big driving insight from EPI's work on schools, it would be the demand that we really get real about the relationships between developments and trends in the broader economy, what we demand or expect from public education, and the resources then that we give schools. Um, there's a great summary statement related to a lot of this work that was in Richard Rothstein's Class and Schools books from the early 2000s. And, even though it was published in the early 2000s, a lot of those findings have really stood the test of time. And basically, the summary is that, we live in a society that's gotten more and more unequal over time, with richer families seeing huge income gains and the rest seeing much more meager gains in their income. Why that matters is because high, stable family income and all the privileges that come with it is a key advantage for kids in education. And on the other end of that, low and volatile income and all the penalties that come with that are also a key barrier to kids' education. So just to share a fact about what money really means for education and your family's resources, about a decade ago, economists measured the spending done by families in the top fifth and the top fifth of the income distribution on children's enrichment activities, and that being summer camps, tutoring, high quality childcare, and the like. In the previous 25 years, the effort put forth by lower income families has risen faster, meaning that they were spending more and more of their income on those sorts of activities. But basically, because of rising inequality, higher income families got a much bigger boost in resources. And that gap in the dollars that families were able to spend just really exploded. In the early 1970s, higher income families spent about 4 times as much as lower income families. But by the 2000s, that gap had grown to about 7 times as much. Now, because in this country, class and race are so connected, the split along those class lines also have a huge impact on what we see in terms of race. So we often see white families who have greater access to resources being more able to do that kind of enrichment spending than many Black families. But in the face of rising inequality, we have somehow taken the persistence of class and race-based gaps in educational achievement as an indictment of schools' performances rather than an indictment on the larger social trends and economic systems in this country, or an indictment on our failure as a society to provide adequate resources to all schools that allow them to really push back against some of these larger trends created by rising economic inequality. Now, and it will come back a little bit later to the need to account for the larger social and economic context when thinking about education, but it's really the root belief of most of EPI's education work. And I'll just end on this one fact about American education that really was news to me when I discovered it. And I think many other people are not aware of this as well. And that is the fact that gaps in assessment scores between kids from high and low income families peak in kindergarten, like that early in the education process. Before 5, there are huge variations in the enrichment and developmental opportunities given to kids. That is dependent largely on family income, as I've already discussed. And once all kids start to have some consistency and commonality in that sort of enrichment and development opportunity, particularly within the context of a public school, these gaps stop growing and they even shrink a bit. These gaps also shrink during school years and re-widen a bit during summers, which also sort of reinforces the importance of having that consistent educational experience. So, in short, exposure to public schools, even in today's public schools that get a bad rap for being under-resourced in any number of ways, that exposure stops the rising inequality of assessment scores. So imagine what we could do if that exposure started earlier with like universal high quality pre-K, or if it provided universal high quality summer programs for kids, or if school year instruction was supported by with the scale of resources that we know we need and that we know are beneficial to kids' education. Yet, as we'll talk about a lot today, the scale of resources is drastically inefficient and just too low to do what we really needed to do.
Thanks so much for that. That was a great overview. I think your broader points we're going to return to again and again, like you said. I might just pick up one thing you said at the end on pre-K, and I would just say, I think in some sense, like providing universal high quality pre-K is maybe the number one aspirational goal for those looking to make public education more transformative going forward. Lots of the rest of this webinar, sadly, is going to detail lots of kind of grim policy threats to public education on the horizon. But I'm just going to linger for a second here and indulge a little bit of a what if we matched our rhetoric about how important young kids' development was with actual action in terms of providing that kind of universal high quality pre-K and what it could provide. We've thought a lot about this at EPI over the years. Our work began with a book in the early 2000s by Robert Lynch called Enriching Kids, Enriching the Nation. And that built on what was then a pretty new research base highlighting the huge social and economic benefits of providing universal high quality pre-K for 3 and 4 year olds. And that research base has just grown over time, including newer work by Lynch, but lots of other work as well. The results look just as promising. Kids who attend high quality pre-K programs who otherwise wouldn't have better academic achievement, they have higher college attendance, they have higher wages as adults, and they're less likely to have contact with the criminal justice system. And all of these benefits mean that even the narrow fiscal benefits of these interventions lead universal high quality pre-K to being essentially self-financing in the long run. The fiscal offset requires some patience. It's a couple of decades before it really begins to fully pay off when kids become adults and start earning those higher wages and paying higher taxes. And we all know policymakers are not patient. They want to be able to claim things happening in the current year. But the benefits are so enormous that they literally almost pay for themselves, or probably do pay for themselves, even in very narrow fiscal terms. And then I would just say again, it's another great case study in how wider social inequalities and formal schooling intersect. Valerie mentioned the achievement gaps between high and low income kids showing up in kindergarten and being stable after that. You know, we've written a lot on the early appearance of these test score gaps over the years at EPI in a series we generally called Inequality at the Starting Gate. I'll just say a side note, future updates of that work will likely be hard to impossible, given that it relies on data that is being systematically destroyed by the Trump administration in their dismantling of the Department of Education, something we'll turn to in a little bit. But one obvious way to narrow those gaps at age 5 is to offer high quality preparation for schooling before then. I mean, obviously it has to be age appropriate, but offering high quality child development for 3 and 4 year olds would lead to many of the troubling test score gaps that plague K through 12 schooling never developing, just being much smaller throughout. And then I'll say one last thing on pre-K. It would offer huge benefits to families just in terms of providing another form of paid childcare. There's a large literature on mothers' labor force participation and how it responds to policies, making childcare more accessible. In forthcoming work, I think just in the next couple of months, we're going to update a bunch of childcare fact sheets we have, which provide state-by-state estimates that say what an ambitious childcare policy would yield in terms of higher women's labor force participation and hence higher GDP in every state. And this boost to families' ability to work is one reason why investments like pre-K are so powerful and why they are sort of self-financing in the long run. And so I just wanted to like really put a pin on that point about how important high quality pre-K is. Um, for now, I'm going to turn to Hilary and have her expand a little bit on one thing Valerie noted, which is just that a key part of EPI's education agenda is highlighting and expanding the research showing that children's education could benefit from increased resources to schools. And I just would like you to talk a little bit, Hillary, about how sure are we about that research, and how contested is that claim, and just talk a little bit about the development of it over time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is a bit of a contested claim, actually, but that's a sign of good progress. So, for decades, there was conventional wisdom among many economists and policymakers that the US spent enough on education, by which they meant an increase in average per pupil spending would not generate substantial gains to educational achievement or future life success for students. This view led many to think that schools had enough resources and just needed to focus on the allocation of those resources across different educational bins or different educational costs to generate better educational outcomes. As a result, lots of education research throughout the 90s and the early 2000s revolved around trying to find ways to turn that existing pool of public resources into better educational outcomes. Lots of these involved schemes to evaluate either teacher performance and fire teachers who were found to be low performers, or to get rid of what was viewed as excess bureaucracy. It's worth noting that this claim that we spend enough on public education was also really convenient for the conservative political movements. It goes along, for example, with the anti-tax movement because it aligns their view that the public sector is bloated. And it also goes along with this anti-union movements, which are always looking to claim that unions, key advocates for greater funding in schools, block easy and useful process improvements. Moreover, the empirical base of the claim that society spent enough on public schools rested on studies that actually didn't do a very good job of solving some really tricky estimation problems. Public education spending is not random, and it depends on a number of factors that are correlated with student success. For example, spending in a district might rise as higher income families move into that area, and therefore property values and taxes increase. These higher income families will likely provide greater in-home resources that will aid their child's academic performance. Simple correlations, therefore, between the level of district spending and student success might show a positive relationship, but that might simply just reflect the level of family resources on average across that district, not that district spending decisions are causally related to student success. This can actually run also in the opposite direction. So much of school funding is explicitly compensatory, meaning it's targeting students that are facing greater socioeconomic disadvantage in an attempt to even out total resources, those at home and publicly provided resources, available to students for their academic success. If this greater spending targets students with fewer in-home resources, you could also kind of see this negative relationship. So we could have a positive relationship and we could have a negative relationship between levels of spending and student performances. And again, that still wouldn't be reflecting the causal effort of spending. The good news is since the 2010s, really, I would say, newer research has leveraged natural policy experiments that allow us to move beyond correlation to causally estimate the effects of increased public education spending on student achievement. With these stronger research designs, we've actually seen an overturning of these past findings. Additional resources for public schools reliably do produce higher educational achievement, greater life success later on for students as well. Importantly, these gains are greatest for kids in less advantaged groups and for Black and Hispanic students. Josh and I reviewed some of this evidence in recent work that was published on EPI's website, including the work mentioned at the beginning by Peter. I think it's worth walking through why some of this newer research is more convincing in its causal conclusions. Josh, would you want to take us through that?
Yeah, thank you. This is a lot of the research done to identify like the causal effect of spending on student outcomes. It's really clever, but it's also really important because, like Hillary said, the real challenge is disentangling the effect of just money from all the other changes in the school district that often accompany changes in the level of funding. So in short, in the sort of jargon of economists, you want to find exogenous changes in spending that changes not because like the mix of students or families in a district has changed or anything like that, just sort of an unexpected kind of out of the blue change in spending. And basically, the research can essentially be divided into three strands, all looking for those kind of plausibly exogenous changes in spending. And so you got one strand, which is pre-COVID research focused on court-ordered school finance reforms as sort of the natural experiment. Then you have some pre-COVID research on other sources of exogenous variation in school spending. I'll say a little bit more about that. And then the post-COVID research on the large increase in federal fiscal aid to state and local governments earmarked for education as a policy experiment that did not come out with the exact same timing and the exact same distribution across places. So on the first ordered school finance reforms, there were basically two waves of these reforms. In the 1970s and 80s, you saw reforms aimed at equity, trying to narrow spending gaps between the highest and lowest spending districts. And then in the 90s, the reforms were more about mandating a minimally adequate financing level for all districts. And the response to each wave of these reforms was spending for districts in the lowest quintile rose relative to the highest spending. And so these spending increases, they were kind of externally imposed. They were not really planned for. They were not driven by anything happening to the population of families or kids within the districts. They map just reliably onto higher test scores and greater life achievement for the kids exposed to them. And the kids who are not exposed to them, like similar districts in other states or something like that, did not see the gains. And so that's really good evidence that it was the money that mattered there. The sort of second strand of sort of pre-COVID research, besides the court-ordered financing reforms, did like a variety of really clever things. One of them was they looked at outcomes of referenda on bond initiatives to finance new education investment. And they looked at the sort of groups that either very narrowly passed or very narrowly failed on these bond referendum. And the theory is that districts where these referendum narrowly passed and new investments came online should differ from districts where such measures narrowly failed only by the impact of this new investment. Like they had about the same vote on the bond referendum, and so it should only be the fact that it got past that 50% threshold and hence new investments came online that should drive differences in student achievement. And this is what they found. They found that treated districts, those that saw a very narrow passage of a bond referendum to finance new education investments, saw identifiable increases in student test scores after just a few years. And sort of most impressively, these treated districts saw immediate and large increases in home prices. And this strongly indicates that the public really values well-funded schools. And that at the moment, there's no real market that exists to let them easily buy into well-funded schools directly, except for moving into a school district by buying a house there. And so when districts do spend more, families vote with their feet and demand houses in the high spending districts. I would say, clearly market signals should not dictate all decisions about public investment in education, but the fact that even pure market signals show such a clear sign of underinvestment relative to what people are demanding is a really powerful signal that there's a lot more investment in education that could be done and would be highly valued by families. Basically, the studies found that like every dollar in increased educational investments made possible by the narrowly passed bond referenda results in an increase in home prices of more than $1.50. And so that's just a super powerful, to my mind, market signal. I would just say one thing as well on this issue of investments. Lots of these bond referendum were for like capital investments to schools. And the link between investments and student performance has also been made really concrete and specific with a study showing that when schools lack air conditioning, hotter years and months reliably and significantly reduce student performance. But when schools do have air conditioning, there is no heat effect. Research has shown that this differential access to air conditioning by itself might explain 5% of the test score gap between white and black students. And so the idea that there's just not a million margins along which more public investment in education could really start leading to higher and more equitable outcomes just seems to be all over the place. And then finally, the final strand of research looking for these sort of causal effects of spending comes from the variation in the timing and degree of spend out of the really large increase in federal aid to state and local governments for education passed, during and after the COVID pandemic. This aid was specifically passed to account for the need to surge resources to schools whose educational output was being harmed by all the terrible angles of the pandemic. States that spent this aid earlier and to a greater degree saw quicker and larger recoveries in test scores. And I think the really impressive and useful part of the COVID funding is that it was pretty substantial and it actually pushed per pupil funding for many school districts well above its highest point that had ever been before the pandemic. And yet the marginal effect of that increase stemming from the COVID aid was almost exactly in line with what the pre-existing sort of research literature shows. So what this basically means is even the levels that were at their highest points because of the COVID funding in like 2022 and 2023, there was probably still room to go quite a bit above that and still yield reliably greater student achievement gains from more money. And I think that's an important part of that research as well. And so, yeah, that is sort of the sort of techniques people use to really nail down the sort of causal effect of more spending. And it's not just clever, it is really compelling in that it matters a lot.
That makes a ton of sense, and thank you for explaining that. If I could just ask one more question, kind of have all this evidence that it's strong and that greater showing that evidence.
Um, you cut out for 1 second, so I'm going to just repeat what I think you added, what you said, which is
Oh,
that if the
sorry.
evidence is strong that greater spending would help students, is the policy following that
Yes,
evidence?
yes, yes, yes.
And I think the answer is no. And I think the really sad irony is that, like you said, this revolution in the research reassessing the effect of higher spending really happened in the 2010s, when in the real world in the 2010s, outside the academy, the majority of states were enacting some of the harshest cuts to public education in the entire kind of post-war history. I think the education cuts, well, they were largely driven by the sort of the pressures of the burst housing bubble and the Great Recession, but also by GOP-led state governments following the 2010 elections. States with Republican trifectas during this period passed very austere state budgets and spent significantly less than states without a Republican trifecta. I would say by 2019, some of these cuts were finally starting to be kind of rolled back, albeit still lagging the growth needed to keep up with our capacity to spend. Um, and then, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we did spend a lot more, but the need was so much larger because, again, all of the pressure that the pandemic put on education. And so I would say just on the spending, and now that pandemic aid is going away, federal aid is exhausted. Schools are going to go back to the pre-pandemic spending levels, which were, in our view, under-resourced. And then we have other cuts on the horizon in front of us. One of the biggest ones, which I think we'll talk about in a little more detail later, is the Trump administration attacks on the Department of Education. Those are going to be really big and important and bad. And then I would also say an underrated education policy sort of bit of damage being done is the Medicaid and SNAP cuts in the Republican tax and spending sort of mega bill that was passed in 2025. Those could have profound impacts on education. Food stamps or SNAP pays for many school-related nutrition programs, and research has really convincingly shown us the obvious. Kids suffering from hunger and food insecurity just don't learn well, and so any cuts to those is going to hurt educational achievement. And school nutrition programs aren't just crucial for the welfare of the kids and the families, but again, they're sort of educational achievement and later success. And Medicaid, similarly, provides key funding that provides school-based services, particularly for kids with disabilities. But this can also include vision and dental care. And again, research shows the obvious. Kids with untreated vision problems or dental pain just don't learn very well. And addressing these is often a really, low cost, high value way to get better education achievement and less suffering. But these services could be at risk as states find their federal funding for Medicaid cut back due to that sort of mega bill. And then again, at the state level, or additionally at the state level and both the national level, there's been a push to try to redirect public dollars to pay for kids going to private schools, especially through very large voucher programs. A number of states have significant voucher programs that divert serious money from public schools for this. And so, no, we've got this research that shows more resources would just reliably lead to really big gains for education, and policy seems to be going exactly in the wrong direction on that. Um, and so I might ask Valerie to talk a little bit about making this a little less abstract and talking about some of the ways that insufficient funding for schools really shows up in today's classrooms and education sort of landscape.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Two of the biggest ways that insufficient funding in public schools shows up is one, in low teacher pay, and two, in teacher and staff shortages. And those two things are not unrelated. Teacher quality is the most important school-related factor influencing student achievement. And the way to retain and attract high quality teachers is by providing teachers with compensation that is commensurate with what they would earn in other occupations. So we compare teachers' pay to that of similarly educated and experienced professionals. Again, I think it's pretty much a no-brainer. Low teacher pay influences career choices away from the field of education. And that has implications and affects the pipeline of teachers for decades down the line. EPI's research on teacher pay goes back 15 years or so. It was started at EPI by Sylvia Allegretto, Larry Michel, and Sean Corcoran. Sylvia, who's now at the Center for Economic Policy Research, continues to publish that work with EPI each year. So big shout out to Sylvia and appreciation for really putting that work on the map. But because public school teachers have to get a bachelor's degree to teach in the US, we compare weekly earnings of public school teachers, and that being elementary, middle, and secondary or high school, with those of college graduates that choose other careers. I think we're going to put a figure in the chat that will allow you to see the historical analysis since 1996. And the sort of punchline there is today's teachers earn about 27% less than comparable college graduates. But we should also not lose sight of the fact that in the mid 1990s, that gap was almost zero. So this issue, though it's not a new issue by any means, it didn't just show up. It has not always been as extreme or excessive as it is now. Since at least 2018, and especially since the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, labor market data has clearly signaled that there is almost a textbook labor shortage for public school teachers. In the years leading up to the pandemic, the teacher labor market saw high job vacancy and quits rates and stagnant hires. That's because teachers were already becoming less willing to accept teaching jobs. And their associated compensation rates and working conditions in the period leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic were, also already really challenging. In our research in California, teachers and support staff also describe the impact of those shortages. California has one of the highest student to staff and student to teacher ratios in the country. So what that means is that teachers and staff are tasked with doing way too much in the classroom without the resources needed to be successful in carrying out those tasks. So one of the common recommendations there is the need for more paraprofessionals. That was what people asked for when they said, well, what would you do with the additional funding? We'd get more support staff in the classroom. Those shortages also, take a toll on teachers individually in terms of their mental health. The survey of the American teacher shows that the share of teachers that were very satisfied with their careers has fallen over the last 50 years and currently is at its lowest point. So more funding for public schools would help to close the teacher shortage and would help to attract and retain enough teachers to fill currently vacant positions. I think the sort of add-on to that is it would just improve teachers' quality of life and mental health as well.
Thanks for that. I'm going to turn to Hillary for a second and just talk a little bit more about that teacher pay finding because it is so striking, particularly the really large decline since the late 1990s. And so the one question is, did we really used to pay our teachers a fully fair wage? And have we backslid this badly since then? And then maybe put it in context with like the resources that public education need to thrive.
Totally. And I'm just going to flag, my internet's a little choppy, so if you can't hear me, just shout. But to answer your question, I think this teacher pay and the decline over time is like a pretty perfect case study for how the need for resources for public education that go into things like paying teachers is totally inseparable from trends in the private economy. In the decades past, the labor market for highly educated women was very constrained relative to that for highly educated men. Teaching was one of the few occupations for highly educated people that was completely open to women. Because of this, and because so many other occupations were far more closed to women, this meant that attracting and keeping a very talented workforce in teaching was easier. The exit options just weren't there. And so the pay for teachers didn't have to be all that high. Um, that means that, in the mid 1990s, when we started measuring the teacher pay gap, there wasn't a huge teacher pay penalty. There was some, but it was not large. And there was really no teacher pay penalty for women. Women with college degrees in teaching earned about what women with college degrees earned elsewhere in the economy. To be fair, or to be clear, that doesn't mean that teachers were paid fairly. It just meant that they were paid unfairly as women operating in the rest of the private economy. This unfairness was obviously bad, but it also meant that as a society, we were able to get good public education more cheaply because opportunities for highly educated women were constrained. Um, as occupational segregation improved over time, opportunities for women in other fields have increased, and pay for college educated women has been rising. Teacher pay, however, did not keep up. If we want a really big pool of highly qualified teachers, they need to be paid on par with what they could earn in other jobs with their credentials. In general, when there is private sector growth, a higher share of resources must go to the public sector to keep the quality and the quantity of that public service constant. As a country gets richer, it has to change the allocation of those resources a bit for that balanced growth. If it doesn't happen, then public services like education will suffer. So, put another way, over the past 30 years, teacher pay has not kept pace with the pay of private sector peers because we didn't make that tweak in the allocation of resources. But it is a necessary step for keeping resources available for public education.
Thanks for that. I do think that the linkage between private and public labor markets and how it has to sort of guide what people think is the appropriate level of spending on public education or any public good is super key. So turning now, I'm going to go back to Valerie and think through some of the policy levers that could address a lot of these questions. We just know that the majority of education policy is managed locally or at the state level, including funding, staffing, course curriculum, other school policies. But how does the administration's plan at the federal level to essentially dismantle the Department of Education and quote unquote return education to the states materially change what happens to schools over the next couple of years?
Yeah, that is a bit of a complicated question because it is true that most of the day-to-day functions and operations of public schools are and have always been handled at the state and local levels. So in that sense, there's really very little, if anything, to actually return to, states. But it's important to understand the role of the Department of Education and why that agency was established. In recognition of the importance of education, both to the well-being of individuals and to our nation and economy, one of the primary purposes of the Department of Education has been to ensure equal access to educational opportunities for all students. So the existence of a federal Department of Education represents our national commitment to making education more of a right than a privilege by eliminating two of the greatest barriers to achieving that goal. One is one we've already spoken about quite extensively is the inadequacy of funding. We know there are differences across states in how much they support public education with public dollars. The second barrier is literally discrimination. There was a whole civil rights battle on desegregating schools and what that meant in terms of the resources available to students in different schools, but also just the opportunities that students had to gain an education, that individuals had to be employed as teachers, so on and so forth. Dismantling the agency currently then essentially compromises two of the mechanisms for doing that. Again, that is federal funding to under-resourced schools and the enforcement of federal civil rights laws. I will add to that, they've also done a fair amount of destruction to the statistical capacity of the Department of Education. And so our capacity to collect the data and fund the research necessary for measuring and understanding educational outcomes has also been severely compromised. Now, while legally closing the Department of Education would require an act of Congress, the president can't do that on its own. It is also true that the DOGE cuts had a significant impact on the agency. They slashed staff at the Department of Education by nearly half. And related to that, many of the responsibilities that have been congressionally mandated for the Education Department to oversee have now been offloaded to other federal agencies. And specifically, we've talked some about Title I funding going to poorer school districts. That now has been sent over to the Department of Labor. It's also true that many of the contracts related to education research were terminated. Relatedly, staffing at the National Center of Education Statistics, which is the statistical agency of the Department of Education, that staffing was completely gutted. That started with the firing of the commissioner last February. Also, just kind of put NCES in context, it was the federal government's third largest statistical agency, and that coming after the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which, as we also know, had a similar experience with the commissioner being, fired for no real reason, and staffing shortages after that impacting operations. A side note, though, I talked about the contracts for research that were also cut. NCES data work was done largely and primarily by contractors, and that's because of congressionally mandated restrictions on staffing. So again, the staffing within the agency that was largely responsible for managing those contracts, the contracts that went out to the people who were actually conducting the research and collecting the data, all have an impact on what we know and can do about education inequities and educational outcomes. Just to be a bit more specific about that, the data collected by NCES is what informs what we know about teacher shortages, what we know about the relationship between the skills gap and socioeconomic status, and how schooling helps to close those gaps. And it also was the source for how we understand differences in spending in schools across states. So that will have a major impact on our ability as a nation to really stick to that commitment for equal educational opportunities for all individuals. Now, coming back to this claim of returning education to the states, that's more of a rhetorical flourish, if you will. But some would argue that during Trump's second term, the Department of Education has actually exerted more control over things like curriculum and school policies, given their very heavy-handed approach and interpretation of civil rights enforcement. So in addition to a roughly 25% staffing cut in the Office of Civil Rights, that department has also been weaponized in service to the administration's anti-DEI agenda and extremely narrow view of civil rights. Again, this sounds very similar to what is happening and has happened at the EEOC as it relates to employment-related discrimination. Now, at the K through 12 level, most of the focus of the Office of Civil Rights has been on transgender student policies and DEI. Then DEI covers both programs that schools might have to provide more support to students of color, or curricula in terms of the things that are being taught. We've all heard the culture wars and the anti-woke agenda and getting critical race theory out of schools. So that all is a part of their current focus. It's also unique that this current Office of Civil Rights is proactively pursuing charges against those deemed to be at odds with the administration's views, as opposed to in previous years, schools, individuals would file a claim and then they would investigate those claims. So they're being very proactive in targeting schools and districts that they feel are at odds with their views on civil rights that are ahistorical in many ways. And they're also threatening to withhold funds from schools. In cases where that has gone into a legal battle, most courts have blocked their ability to withhold that funding. It's also important to know that the withholding of funding from schools is not something that the Office of Civil Rights has done really since the 1960s, when there were schools who just refused to desegregate. So that also is something that's a bit out of the norm in terms of how the education department has operated in more recent history. Now, given the massive job cuts across all federal agencies, including the Department of Education, and the generally chaotic decision making of this administration, I think there's little confidence that there won't be collateral damage to schools and districts that depend on that federal support. And that's because when major programs like Title I are being administered by agencies with limited expertise or familiarity with the laws governing those programs and the detailed formulas that are used to make sure that funds are distributed in ways that the districts most in need receive them, that's going to, have implications down the road in terms of the timing that it can take to get those resources, whether or not, districts that received a certain amount of funding in the past will continue to get that. And so there's just a lot of confusion about how programs that essential will operate within an agency that doesn't have that historical expertise and familiarity with administering it.
Thanks, Valerie. I had earlier promised we would do a bit of a grim march through some policy threats, and as advertised, but super informative and useful to know. I would say we're getting on in the webinar, and we've yet to talk about vouchers, which might be the single biggest education policy on the radar today. So I'm going to just turn to Hilary and talk through some of her work on the potential harms of vouchers, particularly for kids who don't use them and who actually remain in public schools.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just note when we're talking about vouchers, what we're really talking about is public funding for private education. And we've seen these play out at the states. There's a federal voucher that was passed in the 2025 reconciliation bill. And I'm just going to detail some of the costs here because I think they're pretty extreme. To begin with, there are enormous direct costs in introducing any new demand on public expenditures, like a voucher program. Vouchers put pressure on public budgets, including school budgets, even if they're not directly coming from public school allocations. A lot of vouchers end up going to students who have never been in public schools. And so, in effect, we're introducing a new expense onto these public budgets. I should note these costs are not small. In Arizona, for example, which has a pretty substantial voucher program, researchers calculated the total cost to be around $740 million in 2024 alone. Moreover, these programs and the private schools that are accepting vouchers really aren't subject to the same level of accountability or reporting transparency as public schools. Vouchers have been found to be spent on luxury travel, for example, or home goods. And schools that are accepting voucher dollars do not have to report student achievement outcomes. These subsidies, these vouchers, they go to pretty affluent families. And a key source of potential inequality or inequity here is that vouchers are often quite limited for use for families in rural districts, where there's generally not a plethora of school options or private school options to even use these vouchers. What that means in practice is that vouchers are really subsidizing these affluent urban families at the expense of public school resources elsewhere in the country, and that's a problem. There's also an under-recognized, but we think extremely important source of stress that voucher programs can impose on the ability to provide excellent public education. We call this cost the fiscal externality in economic terms, and that's imposed on the school districts, the students, and the families when declines in student enrollment numbers due to students taking up these voucher programs intersect with the fixed nature of school costs. Again, in economics terms, an externality produces an outcome for those who otherwise aren't responsible for that decision at hand. In this case, the fiscal externality is the negative effect that vouchers will have on public school systems that will now receive less money from the government. To make that feel a little bit more concrete, let's just say that a school district loses 10% of their students to private schools through a voucher program. When these students leave suddenly, schools are left to educate any time to adjust their costs. Less child in need of transit. Buildings still need to be heated and cooled, even if classroom size goes down. Because these fixed costs can't be adjusted when total revenue declines due to students leaving for private schools with a voucher, the districts are then stuck paying more per pupil on the costs they can't adjust, like the school bus routes and the heating and cooling, and that leaves less money to spend on the costs that can be adjusted. Those are often things like school supplies, though, extracurricular activities, even teacher salaries.
Thanks for that. And I think part of your answer was about how vouchers can basically do harm to students who choose to remain in public schools because of sharp changes in enrollment. Are there any other threats out there that could spark sort of the same damaging dynamic, sharp changes in enrollment, putting a lot of pressure on school districts?
Yeah, I mean, vouchers are certainly one such example, but I think there's a really big threat to enrollment in public education coming from the immigration space right now. And so the way that I think you could think about this is one of the big threats that we see is the large campaign of mass deportation being undertaken by the Trump administration. This campaign is both actively removing people and is contributing to a climate of fear that might cause some families to relocate out of areas experiencing a lot of ICE enforcement activities. They might relocate out of the country, entirely, or just to other regions not experiencing that surge of ICE enforcement. This will very likely reduce enrollment in areas of the country where ICE activity is intense, and that will have very high costs for the students that remain. Um, One more thing just to keep in mind in the immigration space, there is a play, anti-immigration advocates are making a play to overturn a landmark Supreme Court ruling called Plyler versus Doe, that all children have the right to a free K-12 public education in the US, regardless of their immigration status. This case was, done in 1982, and it largely centered on whether states could prohibit the use of state funding to educate children who were living in the U.S. Without citizenship documentation. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor, saying that, of course, the harm of not educating undocumented children would be worse for society than providing a basic education, due to all of these positive spillovers education provides. If Plyler is overturned, there is a real threat that immigrant-heavy schools will lose a substantial share of their students due to fears of deportation, either fears or actual deportation. And this, of course, will be harmful for students in immigrant families, but it will also have a high cost for the students that are remaining in public school.
Thanks for that. We're getting close to the end. I want to make sure I get this question in, so I'm going to turn right to Valerie. We talked earlier about the teacher pay penalty and how the wider labor market is really important for determining resources that go to public schools. Is there another big example of how wider private sector markets influence how we should think about education spending?
Yeah, it will be the housing market. Because we know as a general rule of thumb, the way kids are assigned to public schools in this country is based on where their family owns or rents a home. But also, American housing markets are deeply segregated by class and race, even today. The racial segregation was created by explicitly racist laws and policy, and is now held in place even in the face of, putatively race-neutral law and policy, by class barriers that still fall very disproportionately on Black families. So high amenity neighborhoods with excellent public schools, like, for example, Chevy Chase, Maryland, might no longer have explicit racial covenants barring Black families from buying houses in those communities. But the concentration of income combined with restrictive zoning practices basically means only extremely affluent families could afford to live there. And that barrier is something that does not hit white and Black families equally. Also, for most school districts, they rely primarily on local revenue sources to fund schools, and that's usually coming from property taxes. But because property values are higher in affluent neighborhoods, the same property tax rate can lead to much higher revenue in those neighborhoods. That also gives them a big advantage in funding. So the optimal solution to lots of those problems that segregated housing markets pose to today's educational environment would be desegregation. But until that happens and is more widespread, we can help to ameliorate some of the damage by just making sure we spend enough and direct the spending to districts that would otherwise be severely resource constrained. One example on that, when an economist looked at the effect of court-ordered desegregation on student outcomes, they found large positive effects. And the main mechanisms through which desegregation spurred greater educational achievement was by providing the Black students higher levels of resources or more per pupil spending and reductions in class size. Again, all the things we've been talking about today of why resources and funding are so critical. Now I'll stop there so we can
Yeah, no, thank you so
give it
much for
some
that.
points.
Super important answer. I would say I'm going to maybe just wrap together a couple of questions that came in um, previously from the audience and just sort of make a closing sort of statement out of it before asking Hillary and Valerie if they have any last things. It's basically the questions were, what are the research and policy advocacy we need to sort of turn this situation around to make the research showing more resources will provide better outcomes actionable? Um, I think one big part of it is just we need more people who are sort of understand and are trumpeting the fact that this has been a real revolution in research. Like for decades, people were pretty complacent with, no, it seems like we spend enough on public education. We just need to spend it better. That's not true. The research has shown we would get better outcomes, higher achievement if we spent more. And then if we distributed that spending progressively to districts and students who are resource constrained, we could have really big payoffs with sort of cost benefit ratios that are just sort of off the charts in terms of how good it would be for society to do. And then I would say two other things. I think underrated parts of the education policy debate is one, it is also a tax debate. This money has to come from somewhere, tends to come from state and local governments who cannot run deficits generally. And so I think revenue and taxes are a big part of this debate. And I'm very dismayed about the unwillingness of many who should be willing to stand up and say public services are valuable and good, and we should be willing to pay for them, not being willing to do that. And then I think supporting people, and this is going to be as self-serving as it can get, like EPI, who really understand the intersections between private sector labor markets and other markets and the resources needed for public education, who can make those links really apparent to policymakers, is just a really key part of this puzzle because it is complicated. But if you do nothing but allow the private sector to grow without directing more resources to the public sector, you'll actually degrade its quality pretty consistently over time. Anything from Valerie and Hillary before we turn it back over to Jen for a wrap up? Or are you two good? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. And Jen, I was gonna kick it back over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I want to say thank you to everyone who gave us your time and attention this afternoon. We really appreciate your participation and your attendance. Thank you to Peter for joining us from his busy day at William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. We appreciate your partnership and support. And if you would like to find more great education work from EPI, I dropped a link in the chat. And yes, we did record, and all of the links in the chats, even the ones that you guys shared, as long as they are safe for work and appropriate, are going to be in the recap that we send out to you next week. So thanks and have a great day.